Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have a discussion on the newspaper of 6th of May 2024. So let's begin with the list of articles first. So we have these three articles for detailed discussion. A discussion on Indian Defence University and the requirement, the need that we have for it. Then make the poor richer without making the rich poorer. This is the other article that we have on your editorial pages. And then the third article, an overview of Sudan's civil war. So we'll have a detailed discussion on the ongoing conflict in Sudan and also the historical background of the same and some of the issues that we have seen around with this civil war. So these are the three articles that we are going to have a detailed discussion on. And then from the prelims perspective, we have one article today, and this is India has stringent norms for pesticide residue limit. So this is in the context of some of the controversies that we have seen with some Indian spice makers. So we'll discuss that. And then lastly, one article, Netanyahu orders news network Al Jazeera to stop work in Israel. So we'll discuss about what exactly the issues are and where exactly is this headed. So let's begin with the first article. It's time to operationalize the Indian Defence University. Now, this particular commentary, it discusses the significant gap that we have seen in India's defence educational structure, and notably the absence of any Indian Defence University in India. Now, when we look at this, when we look at some of our neighbors like Pakistan and China, you will see that they have established multiple defence oriented educational institutions. Now, it is in this manner that the article talks about that India also needs something of a similar sort. Although it's not that it's a new demand, it's a new request, it is something which has been in discussions in India for more than 50 years now. So that's why it's time to make it happen is what the argument is in this particular article. Now, very interestingly, it starts with a very famous remark by Greek thinker Thucydides. Now, when we talk about this particular remark, he basically says, or this remark says that distinction, a nation which makes a distinction between its scholars and warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. So this is the context, or this is the remark with which this article actually starts. Now this remark, it highlights the importance of integrating the scholar rigor with the military training to ensure that the strategic thinking is not diverged from the defense operations. And that's why when we look at this particular article, it talks about the evolving nature of the warfare as well. And that's why it emphasizes for the requirement for a very robust professional military education to prepare the military officers for dynamic and uncertain combat environments as well. And that's why when we look at the United States, in United States we see that there is a professional military education, and this is something that has evolved as a model in the United States. Particularly some of the reforms that were initiated by Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act. So that's why we see that there have been all these discussions about professional military education as well. And that's why in this context, when we see that when it comes to the US, they already have an act according to which they have started professional military education. And that's why when we look at some of the ways in which some of the other countries also have been moving forward, India also needs to recognize the need for the same. And when you go back into the history of Indian defense as well, you'll find that India had recognized the need for a dedicated defense university shortly after the independence itself. And there were various committees over the decades reiterating the importance of establishing an Indian defense university to consolidate and advance military education. Now, despite the initial approval that happened in 2010 for setting up an Indian Defence University in Gurgaon, progress has been very slow. It has been lacking an integral, you can say, professional military education framework that can incorporate all the multidisciplinary strategic thinking into the perspective as well. And that's why the proposed Indian Defence University would not only unify the theoretical and practical aspects of the military education, but also, you can say in a manner, it would diversify the curriculum into including a broad range of subjects which are very pertinent to the national security. And that's why the urgency of establishing this Indian Defence University has been framed as very critical for enhancing India's defence preparedness and strategic culture, and at the same time to have an inter-service integration, particularly in the context of modern joint war fighting capabilities that India would have to build. So that's why from that perspective it advocates for something called as the Indian Defence University. So that's why just remember some of the important points, that countries like Pakistan and China, they have already established these kind of institutes, and for India it is also very very crucial, and especially because of the uncertain nature of the modern warfare. And in US we already see that this is there. In India also since 1967 we have seen that there has been a recognition for the need for having such an Indian Defence University. And despite the approval that we already have seen for establishment of IDU in Gurgaon, yet we have seen that our whole progress has been very slow. And that's why it is very crucial to have this, because subjects which are relevant to national security, merging the sciences and humanities to foster broad-based strategic thinking, it is something which is very very crucial. So this is what the author here argues for, and it's very very crucial for us also to understand the context. Now coming to the next article, make the poor richer without making the rich poorer. Now what exactly is this discussion about? Now what we saw was that there has been a heated discussion that has started, a debate that has started in India surrounding the concept of redistribution of wealth, which was triggered by the Congress Party's election manifesto. Now the broader discussion basically moves beyond the political rhetoric to try and address India's stark economic disparities, which have seen some widening of the difference between the rich and the poor. Now, when it comes to this trend is not something which is unique to India only, but this is something that has become a global phenomenon. And when we look at the real debate actually centers on the methods to try and bridge this gap between the rich and the poor. And this is something which becomes a very difficult challenge right now. Now, this is actually, you can say in a manner, also a challenge which has been acknowledged universally, and particularly we have seen that in the context of the nations which are experiencing some rapid economic growth, for example India. So that's why in this context, when we look at this, we have to understand that how exactly can we address the widening economic disparity in India and also globally. And just 4-5 days back we had a discussion on this topic as well, where there was a suggestion of how exactly can we move forward and what can be done in a manner so that India can start to think of how to bridge this gap. Now, in this context, the article actually critiques the concept of something called as Pareto optimum. Now, Pareto optimum, this is a sociological concept, all right? A sociological concept, and also something that applies to economics, where what we basically see is that it suggests that improving one person's situation could worsen somebody else's situation, all right? So suggesting that while developing nations may have limited growth potential, developed nations may have limited growth potential, developing nations like India can grow rapidly and thus have different strategies for reducing inequality. Now, when we talk about something like a wealth distribution or taxing the rich and all these concepts, these actually come from this concept of Pareto optimum, where we say that improving situation, or let's say improving, this says that improving one person's situation worsens another person's situation, worsens another's. All right, so this is basically what it says. This is the concept. Now, so in this context, what we are saying is that if, let's say, somebody says that, okay, take all the money from the rich and distribute it to the poor, so in that case you are actually going with this concept of Pareto optimum, where you are saying that you will make the rich poor and you will try to make the poor rich at the same time, at the cost of the rich getting poor. So that's why while all the developing nations in this context, they would need to follow, developed nations can follow this path up to an extent, because given the fact that they have a slower growth, because they have grown already, so now their growth trajectory is slower. But in case of developing nations have the potential to grow rapidly, and thus that's why they can enhance equity without any kind of detriment to the others. Meaning that India, for example, has a very good growth potential, so we need not redistribute the wealth. We need not take the wealth from the rich and distribute it to the poor, because we have a lot of opportunities available where we can start giving those opportunities to the poor, so that they can also start growing, so that they can also start getting richer at the same time, not at the cost of the rich. So rich can hold on to their wealth, at the same time the poor can start getting richer, is what a developing country can actually do. And that's why when we, in this context, when we look at the potential role of taxes, such as these concepts that we are discussing for the last couple of weeks, such as wealth tax and inherent tax, suggesting that these kind of measures, which are very often seen as punitive, do not substantially contribute to reducing any kind of inequality. So that's why instead they may actually, what they might do is that they might start reducing the investment and economic growth, and something which is very crucial for increasing the overall wealth. So that's why we have to understand this, that wealth and inheritance taxes, they potentially can be punitive and ineffective for significantly reducing the disparity. And that's why instead these taxes could deter the investment and the economic growth. So that's why this kind of an effort may not be good, or it is something that may not be may not lead to the kind of result that we want. And that's why we need to understand that India's specific challenges, such as, you can say, lopsided economic growth or jobless growth and the taxation system, etc., they are disproportionately burden towards the poor and the middle class compared to the corporations. So this is one of, for example, one of the data that had come up. It says that when you look at the direct and the indirect taxes in India, direct and indirect taxes in India, in that case, what we see is that 64% of it is being collected from the poor and the middle class. Poor and the middle class, whereas only 36% of it is coming from the corporates. So this is maybe something where we need to focus upon, that how exactly can we bring things into account, where the poor are not paying such a high amount of tax as compared to the people who already have a lot of tax. So that's why maybe there is a third way out that we can look towards, so that we can try to ensure that we can enhance the taxes and redistribute the taxes in a manner that we are helping the poor and the middle class. So that's why we need to understand that we perhaps can shift to an economic policy to better balance between the capital and labor, and at the same time try and incentivize a corporate employment and also promote labor intensive industries. So that's why maybe these are the things that can be done, that we can leave, we can try to understand how exactly the things can be managed, how for example, how we can better balance, we can have a better balance between capital and labor. So one can be having a better balance between capital and labor. All right, better balance between capital and labor. Then at the same time, maybe also incentivizing corporate employment. So incentivizing corporate employment, incentivizing corporate employment. And maybe also we can promote, we can also promote employment, we can, I mean, promote labor intensive industries as well. We can promote labor intensive industries. So maybe these are some of the things that we can do. So that's why ultimately when we look at this, we probably can have a pragmatic approach towards reducing the inequality in a manner that also emphasizes upon the economic growth, job creation, maybe also some tax reforms and some social safety nets or social security also, rather than just having punitive taxation of the rich. So that's why the goal here is to make the poor wealthier, uh, which is something which is more suitable than just making the rich poorer and trying to redistribute that wealth. So this is basically what we have to look towards for a better economic growth of the country. Now coming to the third article, an overview of Sudan's civil war. Now in this entire discussion, I'll probably not go a lot into what the article actually has said, but rather than that, I'll try to explain you what has been happening and what has been the past and some of the analysis around it. This article, I mean, you can read this article. It's a good, you can say, overview of everything that has been happening, but can also become a bit tricky for you and also maybe too much of information for you. So I'll just try to break that down and we'll go beyond the article here to make the things clearer. Now, overall, when we look at this entire scenario of where we are right now in the context of Sudan's civil war, uh, there is a lot that has been happening. So if we, for example, go back into the time when Sudan got its independence, since just after its independence, I mean, until 1956, until 1956, what we basically see is that until 1956 we had a British Egyptian rule in Sudan. Now Sudan got its independence from the British Egyptian rule back in 1956, but the seeds of conflict actually were sown earlier. The colonial administration that we had in Sudan, they had governed the north and the south as separate regions. And at the time of independence, the political power was concentrated largely in the hands of the northern elite, and the southern region, which was ethically, culturally, religiously different from the north, they feared domination and Islamization, which led to the demands for a federal government or a complete autonomy altogether. Now, the immediate trigger, what we basically see is that the immediate trigger that we had back then was the government's decision to reorganize the Southern Army Corps in the Torrid region, which led to a mutiny back in 1955. And this mutiny, which was very harshly suppressed back then, it is something that sparked a very widespread guerrilla warfare that also led to something called as the Anyanya movement that happened movement, which was basically, you can say in a manner, a southern rebel group. So let me just go back. So what I'm basically saying is that it all started back in 1955. All right, 1955, when we had the Southern Army Corps, the Southern Army Corps, and this basically is near around Torrent. Now, this was very harshly suppressed, and this is where we see that this leads to a kind of guerrilla warfare that started there. All right, so that's why we see that it leads to a kind of guerrilla warfare. It leads to a kind of guerrilla warfare, and this basically was led by the Anyanya movement. The Anyanya movement, which basically was a southern rebel group. Now, this conflict was also marked by very significant brutality, including targeting killings and atrocities against civilians in Sudan. Now, after that, we see that when we come to 1972, in 1972, there was an agreement, and this was called as Addis Ababa Agreement. So, in 1972, we see the Addis Ababa Agreement. Alright. Now, this is something that was mediated by the World Council of Churches and All Africa Council of Churches that ended the war. So, this was, you can say, in a manner, so 1955 onwards, alright, 1955 onwards to 1972, you have the first civil war. You have the first civil war, which ends with the 1972 agreement. Now, this agreement, it granted the South autonomy and established a Southern Sudan autonomous region. Now, this created a regional government and also ensured a degree of self-administration for the southern part of Sudan. Now, then after that, we see that in 1983, a second civil war starts. And this 1983 civil war, this also called as the Second Sudanese Civil War, it started in 1983 and continued until 2005. Now, what happened? Understand the causes. So now we know that we gave the southern part of Sudan a kind of an autonomy and a kind of a self-governance. Now, in this case, what now happens is that the peace that was achieved by the Addis Ababa Agreement, it gradually eroded due to several different factors. First factor, and something that has been a factor in a lot of different conflicts all around the world, and this was discovery of oil in the south. Now, this heightened conflict over the control and the revenue sharing between the south and the north. Now, in this context, what we basically see is that the president of Sudan back then, Jafar Nimeri. Now, Jafar Nimeri, he attempted to impose a Sharia law across the entire country, including the non-Muslim areas of the south. And this is something that reignited the tension. So 1983, there are certain things that we see in 1983, because 1983 we see is the start of the second civil war. All right, start of the second civil war. What are the reasons here? What are the different reasons because of which it is happening? First, the discovery of oil. First was discovery of oil in the south. Discovery of oil in the south. Second, imposition of the Sharia law. Alright, the imposition of the Sharia law even in the non-Muslim southern areas. And then after that, we see that there was an abolition of the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region back in 1983 by the President Nimeri. So now what we see is that President Nimeri first he imposes Sharia law, and second what happens is we see the abolition of the southern Sudan autonomous region. So this happens. Now, once this happened, this is basically that something that led to the start of the second civil war. Now, the Sudan People's Liberation Army or movement, which was led by John Garang, emerged as the dominant group in the southern areas, and it became a dominant southern rebel group. And unlike the first civil war, which was largely confined to the southern Sudan, the second war had a broad geopolitical implications, with all the neighboring countries such as Ethiopia, Uganda, Libya, all these countries also playing a very important supporting role because they were supporting various different factions. All right, so that's why this becomes very, very crucial, because the Sudan People's Liberation Army, that basically starts to take place. So this is where we see that the southern parts, it become very different in all this. So here what we see is that in this civil war we have the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or also called as movement. So this in 1983. So that's why just what we see is that because now the first civil war was right now confined in the southern areas, but now what we see is that all the other countries which are nearby or which are the neighboring countries, they also start participating. So countries like, that's why Ethiopia or Uganda, we see that all these countries, they also, even Libya for example, they start playing major roles. Alright, they start playing major roles and they start supporting various different factions. Now this war was one of the longest and the bloodiest that we have seen in African history. It resulted in over 2 million deaths and 4 million people who were displaced. Now what we then see is that in 2005, finally, there was a comprehensive peace agreement. So in 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement. A comprehensive peace agreement. Now, this is something that was brokered by Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and it was also supported by some of the international actors like the US and Norway. So they played very, very important role in ending this conflict, and it established protocols for governance, for security arrangements, for wealth sharing, and also set a stage for a referendum on the South Sudanese independence. Because today, as you can see, that you have these two areas of Sudan and the South Sudan, but this South Sudan autonomous region was completely abolished back in 1983. So that entire region again had become Sudan. So now it sets a stage for also referendum for South Sudan independence. So now what we see after this, the post comprehensive peace agreement developments, what we see is that it leads to South Sudan's independence. In accordance with the CPA, South Sudan held a referendum in 2011 where overwhelmingly they voted for independence. So ultimately what happens is that in 2011 you see independence of or creation of South Sudan. Alright, so this basically happens. Now, but unfortunately what we see is that even this joy of creation of South Sudan, even this remains very short-lived, because we see a lot of problems again happening in South Sudan as well. So overall what we have seen is that both the countries, they have struggled with internal conflicts after separation as well. In Sudan, the economic difficulties and the political transitions, they have led to continued unrest and conflict, including the kind of conflict that we have seen in the Darfur region. So this area that you have right here, this area is called as the Darfur region, and this is where we see that a new crisis started back in 2003. In 2003, it led to a lot of unrest, a lot of conflict, and that also has been going on since then. And it has, you cannot still say that it has stopped, and it had started back in 2003. In South Sudan, the disputes within the ruling party, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, it led to a devastating civil war that started back in December 2013. So in 2013, what we see is that in 2013, we see that unrest, or you can say in a manner, a civil war starts. So even in South Sudan, a civil war starts in 2013, and it is something that has been marked by ethnic violence and humanitarian crisis since then. So overall, when we look at the implications and the ethnic and the cultural factors that we have seen, the conflict in Sudan, they have underscored the challenges of state building in ethically and culturally diverse societies, particularly in the post-colonial states, where the borders often do not reflect the ethnic or cultural realities. And at the same time, the problems with resource management. Oil has been both a boon and a curse for Sudan and South Sudan, providing much needed revenue also, but at the same time, it has fueled a lot of corruption and conflict. And both the civil wars and the ongoing conflicts right now that we see, they have set very significant international involvement, and also has reflected not only humanitarian concerns but also geopolitical interests that we have in this strategically important region. And the legacy of these civil wars, they continue to affect the political and the social dynamics of both Sudan and South Sudan today. And that's why they also illustrate the complexities of managing the diversity and also the resources in the context of the post-colonial era in many of these countries. The two major civil wars, for example, in Sudan, they have been among the deadliest of the conflicts in the modern African history. The death toll is estimated to be over 2 million for just the second civil war alone. Majority of these deaths were not only combat related, but they also have been because of famine, or also because of diseases which have also been increased because of the conflict. And according to the according to the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHRC, HCR, the conflicts, they have created one of the world's largest displacement crisis, with millions of people who have been displaced over several decades. And as of recent years, there are still more than 2 million internally displaced people in Sudan and over 2 million in South Sudan. So that's why we have seen that there have been a lot of issues that have been going on. So Sudan, we understand that Sudan has been facing a lot of these problems. But even South Sudan hasn't been away from any of these conflicts. Since gaining the independence from Sudan back in 2011, South Sudan has faced numerous challenges and setbacks. And one might think that, okay, the problem was first the Muslim the Muslim areas of the Sudan, or the northern parts, and the non-Muslim areas of South Sudan, where you have a lot of Christians and animists. So now in this context, what we have seen is that South Sudan has been marked by political instability and conflict, most notably the civil war that started back in December 2013, due to the kind of power struggle that we started seeing between the president back then and the former deputy that he had. And the conflict, it very quickly took an ethnic overtune, and that is where we see that there are two basic ethnic groups that we have. One, the Dinka ethnic group, and the second, we have the Nuer ethnic group. So these are the two ethnic groups in the South Sudan, and they have basically this kind of conflict that we have seen. It has led to tens of thousands of deaths and widespread atrocities against civilians in these areas as well. And despite signing off a peace agreement back in 2018, the implementation has been very slow. And that's why we still see that sporadic fighting, it continues in parts of the country, and political fragility, it remains a critical issue in the country, where we see that formation of a unity government happened back in February 2020. It has been seen as a step forward, but still it has been facing a lot of significant challenges altogether. So that's why we have seen that there are all these issues and there are all these challenges that we have seen in these areas, and a huge amount of humanitarian crisis, where we are looking at the numbers of displacements and deaths, which probably are the highest in the uh, recent past. And it has also led to a lot of food insecurity and famines as well. Periodic famine conditions and persistent food insecurity has affected millions of people. And that's why we have seen that a significant portion of the population, it still faces very acute food shortages altogether. And there have been a lot of economic challenges. For example, in South Sudan, we know that it is rich in oil, which accounts for almost all of its exports and a very major proportion of its GDP as well. Still, we see that the economy faces severe challenges. The economy is heavily dependent on oil revenue, which is subject to fluctuations in the global oil prices as well, and production disruptions that happen from time to time due to conflict. And non-oil sectors such as agriculture and infrastructure, they are completely underdeveloped. And that's why economic diversification is very, very limited. And that's why that is something that makes it very, very difficult for having a sustainable development in these two countries. So that's why we have to understand that this conflict that we all see, it has been a long going ethnic conflict. First, what started as a conflict between Muslim and the non-Muslim areas, but then in the non-Muslim areas of South Sudan also, we see that the problem continues, and all these issues, they have not yet been solved. And today, that's why we see that various different parts of the country, both the countries rather, they have been facing different issues altogether. And that's why a lot of displacement, a lot of armed rebellion, and the role of the dictator and how he has been here for more than 30 years, and the role that we see that all the military coup that has happened. For example, just in the last 50, 70 odd years that we see, there have been more than 50 odd military coups that have happened in this particular area. So that's why there are all these issues that we need to be aware of. Now, coming to the prelims based articles. First article, India has stringent norms for pesticide residue limit, says Center. Now, the Indian government basically has responded to the concerns about the pesticide residues in the food items, and also emphasizing that India has very strict standards in these cases. And this, of course, this statement came after the recent actions that we see by the food regulators in Hong Kong and Singapore against Indian spice brands, two of the biggest names here, MDH and Everest, due to findings of some pesticides which are basically ethylene oxide in their products. So because of ethylene oxide, basically what we see is, so brands like MDH and Everest, where we saw ethylene oxide contamination. Now the Hong Kong food regulator, it banned certain spice mixes from MDH and Everest, and Singapore's regulator recalled an Everest food spice product. And in response, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India is testing samples of these and other branded spices which are sold domestically as well, to confirm their adherence to the Indian quality norms. And it's important to note that when it comes to the role of FSSAI, it does not oversee the quality of spices that are exported. It can only see what's here in the domestic market. The Union Health Ministry has refuted the media claims suggesting that the FSSAI has permitted high levels of pesticide residues in the herbs and spices, and labeling these reports, and that's why they labeled these reports as completely false and malicious. The ministry actually clarified that maximum residue limits are tailored for different food products, based on thorough risk assessment and affirming that India maintains some of the strictest of the maximum residue limits which are set globally. So this is basically what India has said, and let's see where the things go forward. Now coming to the last article, and this is related to again Israel-Palestine issue. Netanyahu orders news network Al Jazeera to stop work in Israel. Now, what we have basically seen is that Israel has taken a very significant step of ordering this closure. And this action basically includes confiscating their broadcast equipments, blocking their transmission, and also shutting down the websites as well. Now, this decision, this is unprecedented in Israel's history because it is the first time that Israel has closed down a foreign news organization. Now, the context for this drastic measure, it involves Al Jazeera's continued coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict. And since October 7, we have seen that there has been an extensive coverage of the same. And the network has been also providing round-the-clock reporting from Gaza. And even as Israel's military offensive there has resulted in so many casualties among Al Jazeera's own staff itself. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Al Jazeera, the reporters of Al Jazeera, of compromising Israel's security and inciting violence against Israeli soldiers, and that's why he labeled the organization, or rather the network, as Hamas mouthpiece. This is what he said. He said that Al Jazeera basically is nothing but Hamas mouthpiece. Now, the Israeli government's order, it bans Al Jazeera's operations within Israel for 45 days and includes a prohibition on various different devices which are used for reporting, and this is something that was mentioned by Al Jazeera. So we have to see where it goes because we have seen these kind of controversies happening between Israel and Al Jazeera before also, and not only between Al Jazeera and Israel, we have seen certain issues and concerns that have been raised in India also when it comes to Al Jazeera. And again, this is not something which has been new, and it's not only in the context of the present government, but even if you go back into the history of the kind of reporting Al Jazeera has been doing for the news based in India, even back in 2013 or 2011, you'll find that the words that they choose are very different from what the reality is. And that's why we have very carefully chosen words are used, where a lot of ways you might say that it takes a stance which is not completely true and not completely in the context of what has happened in India. So that's why we have seen that Al Jazeera has been very controversial even in India also. And if you look at the reportage of last 20 odd years or even before that, you will see that kind of repeated instances of things like this. So that's why it has remained even controversial in India. Lastly, coming to the mains questions for the day. First question, examine the necessity of establishing Indian Defence University in the light of the evolving nature of global warfare and the existing gaps in India's professional military education. So something that we discussed, and why the requirement with the kind of change that we see in the modern warfare, we need that education. And second, ongoing civil war in Sudan is a reflection of deep-seated structural and societal issues rather than merely a power struggle between military factions. Analyze. So we discussed that, okay, there has been a divide between the north and the south and the various ethnic groups that are there in Sudan and South Sudan of the current. So we have to talk about all these aspects of the conflict in Sudan. So this is it for today's session. Thank you very much for being here.